we're going to pick up with activity 32 now. And so if you're going to have a federal government of enumerated powers, enumerated means listed in a way that you could number or count them. And if you're going to have limits on the federal government stated in the U.S. Constitution, you want to make sure that there are ways of keeping the federal government within those limits. One of the main ways that was understood from very early on was that the Supreme Court would be, or federal courts in general, would be there to stop the federal government from going beyond its limits. You can see in letter A, this is something that was made clear at the ratifying conventions as the people of the United States talked over, the various states talked over the powers that were being assigned or proposed for the federal government. They wanted to be very clear that there were going to be enforceable limits on the federal government because they were afraid that it would become a tyranny that would harm citizens. So you have Oliver Ellsworth at the Connecticut Convention making it clear that this Constitution defines the extent of the powers of the federal government, and especially in Article 1, Section 8. If Congress should at any time overleap their limits like that, the Judicial Department is a constitutional check. You'll sometimes hear people say that the Supreme Court itself later on invented the idea of judicial review just referring to the power of the courts to review whether a government has gone beyond the limits of the Constitution. You'll see people suggest that this is something the Supreme Court invented later on. This is simply not true. This was understood, and you can see many, many, many examples of the founders of the U.S. at the ratifying conventions and in their writings make it clear that they understood that this was a power of the federal courts, and to declare void, as Ellsworth said, any attempt of the federal government or a state government to go beyond the limits of the U.S. Constitution. And in letter B, this was stated in the Federalist Papers by Hamilton, the courts were designed to keep Congress within the limits assigned to their authority in the U.S. Constitution. So this was understood by Hamilton as well. And notice, it's not, we often say, and this is again a very modern, second half of the 20th century, perhaps, understanding that the job of the courts is to interpret the U.S. Constitution. This is not what any of the founders said. It's to keep government within the limits of the Constitution, to apply the U.S. Constitution. I mean, if you think about it, if I write up a quiz or a test or instructions that you need to interpret, it must not have been very clear. When I write a quiz, your job is not to interpret the quiz, it's to answer the questions of the quiz. And also in the case of the courts, their job is to apply the U.S. Constitution and keep government within its limits. We'll talk later about why that word interpretation is sometimes brought in. Letter C is, again, showing Jefferson understood this power of the courts. When he was off in France writing back and forth with Madison during the Constitutional Convention, and then later during this period where amendments are being talked about in Congress, Jefferson emphasizes to Madison that if you put a list of things that the federal government cannot do following the U.S. Constitution, then that would put a legal check in the hands of the judiciary, that the courts would be able to come in and say, look, you can't do what you're doing. The U.S. Constitution, the Bill of Rights, says it clearly, so we're gonna declare what you've done null and void. Also, in the latter part of C, Jefferson emphasizes the point that Scalia will make in letter D, that sometimes it's the people who are pressing for government to do something it's not allowed to do. And so Jefferson points out that if you have good Supreme Court justices in there, in his day, Wythe, Blair, and Pendleton were the names that came to his mind, then they will be willing to stand up for the Constitution against the people when they're pressing for government to do something that government's not permitted to do by the Constitution. Letter D, this is what Scalia means when he says that sometimes the Supreme Court, the federal courts, have to tell the people to take a walk when they're pressing for something that the Constitution does not permit the federal government to do, or state government for that matter. In letter B, Hamilton emphasizes Congress, but there are places in the U.S. Constitution that put limits on states, and the courts have to keep them within their limits also. So when Scalia says the Constitution is to protect us against the will of the people, he's talking about when the people are pressing for the federal government to do something unconstitutional, or for the states to do something unconstitutional.